as the time passes. More of you are going to join. Just to say, some of us are on the campus, some are away from the campus, and there are many that are out of the country and have joined as well. I can see that. I see that Dr. Trimble has joined. He's the vice rector. So, and he will sort of offer his vote of thanks to you, Aaron, as the session ends. But right now, very quickly, I am unable to put your 36-page CV into any sort of a brief that would help at this time. But very quickly to say that you have a PhD and an MA from Stanford University, but that was in sociology, and that's interesting. And you are now a professor in the Department of Educational Policy and Leadership at the University of Albany in State University of New York, right? And I was looking at SUNY, as you call it, and it's the largest comprehensive university system in America. So that says something. And I understand that perhaps Albany is one of its sub-campuses outside New York. I didn't know that. I just looked it up. And you have more than 100 publications, my God. And this does not include perhaps as many research projects that you have done. Very recently, you directed the Global Education Monitoring Report, which is, of course, I think it comes out yearly from UNESCO Paris. And I wonder, when I was there in Paris, I think you joined as the head, as I was leaving, and you came in as the head of the Global Monitoring Report, right? And then that's it. And now you are also, since 2007, you are actually elected to the Comparative International Education Society Board of Directors, and also as a co-editor in their Comparative Education Review, and a CIES secretary as well. And I was looking through the lists of the advisory committees, and so many, I think it was pages and pages, and I said, no, I'm not going there at all. So I see that you are also a visiting faculty in universities of Canada. I'm not going to take the university name. You're a Fulbright scholar. You're a visiting scholar in also Japan, Argentina, Malta, Switzerland, Stanford University, Italy, Berkeley in USA, and perhaps I've missed some. You are on many professional societies and editorial boards of many, many journals. But while we were talking, you talked about two projects that you're doing now that you're very excited with. I would like you to talk to them very quickly or through them, what they are. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rukhsana, dear friend who we've known many years. And it's really, both a pleasure and an honor to be able to speak to you and your colleagues at the college. And I hope that we'll be able to have a very interesting dialogue as we move forward with some of the ideas that I put forward. So just very briefly about these two projects that I'm currently involved in. One is around the issue of climate change, education, and communication. As we all know, this is a very urgent issue globally. The international community meets once a year at what are known the COP meetings, the Council of Parties. The next one is actually going to be in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh, in November. And in conjunction with this UN program, there's something called the Action for Climate Empowerment. And my colleagues and I are working on developing a series or a suite of indicators that speak to the 6 different dimensions of this Action for Climate Empowerment program. They have to do with formal education, training, public access to information, public awareness, public participation, all around climate issues, and then international cooperation. So we've been scouring just literally dozens and dozens of different kinds of data sources in order to develop what we will then put on an interactive data platform to enable kind of better reporting and monitoring of progress with respect to this particular issue of climate education and communication, and I lead the indicator development part of that. The PI, the principal investigator, is a colleague of mine, a professor in Canada, Marcia McKenzie, who's also now in Australia. So that's one project. The other project is a bit of a continuation of my interest while serving as the director of the Global Education Monitoring Report. As you well know, the SDGs, especially the Global Goal on Education, is a very ambitious global project. And for me, one of the most interesting targets is what's called Target 4.7, that speaks about education for sustainability and for global citizenship and gender equality and human rights and such. And it's that particular target that I've been very keen to try and develop in different ways, both in terms of measurement and monitoring, which is some of the work I did when I was in Paris. But since then, together with other colleagues, we formed an NGO called NISSEM, NISSEM.org. And we've been trying to help countries, especially in the global south, to find ways to integrate the themes and issues that are mentioned in Target 4.7, global themes, humanistic themes that we think are so critical, especially developing more social and emotional skills around those themes beyond just cognitive knowledge. And so we've been working in different ways to support national efforts to improve textbooks and other educational materials for teachers and school administrators. So those are the two projects that I'm very pleased to be involved in at this point. And I continue to work a little bit with UNESCO on some reports around climate and environmental issues. As you know, there's a big summit in New York in 2 weeks about transforming education, and an idea to revitalize a very important recommendation that UNESCO member states passed some decades ago. So there's a lot of interesting things going on, I think, in these areas globally. You need to
The
unmute
second
yourself.
one on your, the SDG 4.7, Sustainable Development Goal 4.7, is something that we're also struggling with at our campus. And I think it would be great to see those indicators. Now, over to you for your talk today on post-COVID, the shifting higher education landscape. And I think you are ideally placed to sort of talk to that theme.
Well, again, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm really very honored to be here for the faculty retreat. And I'd like to start by giving you a brief idea of what I hope to present today in my presentation. I want to briefly mention some of the ongoing and emergent challenges for higher education. I'd like to speak a little bit about the global shifts in higher education. Some of the trends that I'll mention actually predate COVID, but in many ways may continue and even become more accentuated in the coming years, and particularly mention some of the teaching and learning shifts that I know your colleagues are very keen to learn and take note of, and their potential impact on the higher education sector. And then I want to briefly just talk about the relationship between higher education and the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and in particular, the issue of education for peace, social justice, and more inclusive societies. And then I'll conclude. So that's the kind of the organization of my talk. So I'd like to begin by discussing some of the traditional ways that I'm trying to get my notes here. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to print them. Let's see if I can do this a little bit differently. It's always a bit complicated when you're starting out here. I'm going to end this for just a minute. Excuse me. All right, let's see if I can do it another way. Yeah, that doesn't work. Okay. All right. So how are we going to be able to do this? Unfortunately, I think I'm going to have to use this mode in order so that I have my notes in front of me, and I do apologize. I will try to make this as large as possible because I have notes that I didn't have a chance to print out. Hopefully everybody can see the presentation here, even though it isn't on the presentation mode.
Yeah,
So
it's perfect. Yeah.
okay, thank you. So traditionally, I think we're all very much aware that one of the key roles that the higher education sector is called upon to perform for society has to do with the preparation of a cadre of elites and to ensure that they have both the skills, knowledge, and let's say proper attitudes that they can really prepare society to move forward. And also that they have a certain level of loyalty and a sense of service, that their service for the country is not meant to just benefit themselves, but actually the greater good of all the people in the society. And so this has obviously been a very important function of higher education historically. Another important function of higher education has been to allocate graduates who come through the universities and colleges into the labor market, making sure that they have acquired relevant knowledge and work-related skills, that they've been trained with, that they're able to move into appropriate positions in the labor market and to generate sufficient income over the course of their lives. Obviously, this should be based on talent and merit, and not based on family connections and such. And higher education should play an important role in terms of the criteria for this allocation in the labor market. A third traditional role of higher education has been to promote research and development, to test conventional and innovative hypotheses, and create a space for non-conventional thinking, to discover new truths and new scientific knowledge. And perhaps more recently, there's much pressure on the higher education sector to develop new applications for existing knowledge that can be useful and utilized in society. And finally, a traditional function of higher education has been to legitimate new areas of professional life or new areas of economic value, new fields of knowledge inquiry, and to support professional communities of practice. All of these would, I think, be considered traditional challenges or roles that higher education is called upon to play. But what we see in recent years is an emergent set of challenges that are quite different, or at least have become more prominent relative to the more traditional roles. I would include among these the following kinds of issues. First, higher education is often now asked to be a driver for local and regional economic development and to help increase the productivity of workers in a much more pronounced way than in the past, working with local businesses and local companies and developing partnerships. It is also asked to help adapt existing technologies that are more, to make them more accessible and more meaningful for local communities. It is meant to promote various kinds of public-private partnerships, both in the community and more broadly. It's increasingly a source of lifelong and life-wide learning. So there are many what are often referred to as non-traditional students, often adults over the ages of whatever, 25, who have come back into systems of higher education, seeking both to re-skill themselves and to learn new areas of inquiry, but also develop interests that they may have acquired as they've gotten older. Universities are meant to address issues around inequality, both social and economic inequality. And recently we see many institutions of higher education being called upon to address issues of sustainability, to become greener themselves, in other words, leaving a smaller carbon footprint, but also developing and creating a cadre of leaders who are going to ensure more sustainable country or society or economy going forward. All of these are become much more emergent and important aspects of higher education in recent years. So let me mention what I see as being some of the main shifts. These are longer shifts in higher education sectors over the past several decades. And then I think the question that we can ask is, to what extent will these shifts continue in the post-COVID era, or to what extent might they move in one direction or the other, based in part on some of the issues that have emerged in the last couple of years. So there are four kinds of shifts that I will make reference to: structural shifts, institutional shifts, shifts that relate to inequalities, and finally issues around finance and expenditure. So there are, let's say, three different kinds of structural shifts that we could mention. One has to do with the expansion of the higher education sector. The second it makes reference to the fact that some countries and regions in the world are higher education is much more concentrated in those countries and regions than in others. And the third point is with respect to the increased mobility, both of students and scholars, and how that's taken place. So let me just show you, I think, one way to think about the expansion of higher education. This is a fairly up-to-date table. You have to keep in mind that data on higher education is, on many educational indicators, tends to be 2 years at least lagging behind. But the fact of the matter is that around the world, there are now about 250 million 250 million young people and adults who are currently enrolled at the tertiary level around now. And this represents like over 100% increase since the turn of the century. So in the last 20 years or so, we've seen a doubling of the actual number of students who are officially registered in higher education. And during this period of time, there's an increasing proportion of women who are now enrolled in systems of higher education. In the year 2000, globally, it was about 45%. And most recently, it's beyond 50%. In fact, in many countries, women are the majority number of students relative to men. Most of this increase in higher education, as you can see also in this slide, has occurred in, let's call it, high income and middle income countries. About 23% of all the enrollments around the world are in high income countries, partly because of the population side. About 75% of higher education enrollments are in middle income countries, and only 3% in low income countries. And as this slide is meant to show, there are major disparities, both at the regional level and at the national level, among different regions in terms of the expansion. We see dramatically increases in higher education, especially at the beginning of the 21st century. And these have continued, especially in places like East Asia and Latin America, but also in various parts of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So this gives you some sense of the growing kind of disparities, regional disparities around the world with respect to the size of the sector. Another way to talk about changes is with respect to the concentration. There are 10 countries in which about 60% of all the enrollments in higher education can be found. These include China, India, the US, Russia, Brazil, Indonesia, Japan, Iran, Turkey, and the Republic of Korea. Those 10 higher education systems comprise about 60% of all the higher education enrollments. So when they change or if they expand, it has a huge impact more broadly. And finally, with respect to these structural shifts, there are many more students, as I'm sure many of you are aware, who are moving from their home locations to study both in their countries and other parts of the country, but increasingly large number of students that are traveling to other countries to pursue their degrees and higher educational experiences. And so the circulation of young people in higher education, short-term and longer term, both students and also scholars, all the evidence would show that there's been a huge increase in this kind of growing scholarly and student mobility. A second point that I made in the slide here is about institutional shifts, and in particular, the growing privatization of the higher education sector and its diversification. And here you can see one of the main, it's very difficult to get kind of clear data. There's a new study that's coming out soon that should provide more valid information about this. But for all kinds of reasons that we could discuss, more and more countries are enabling the private sector or private governing stakeholders to establish institutions of higher education to meet the demand, but also to provide opportunities that might not otherwise be possible for certain sectors of the population in certain regions. So we've seen a very significant growth in the private share of higher education enrollments. About a third of all the higher education enrollments worldwide are found in private higher education institutions. But notice the big differences from different regions. So this is very pronounced in Latin America and the Caribbean, in many parts of Asia, in the United States, and much less pronounced in Europe, even in some of the Anglo-Saxon countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand that still have a very strong public sector, in the Arab states and in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's very interesting to see this privatization trend, and I would argue that this will continue and perhaps become even more pronounced in the post-COVID period. Another important trend has to do, as I mentioned here, with the diversification of higher education, and there are different ways to kind of illustrate this point. One way is to look at the number of short cycle institutions. So we think most higher education is made up of, let's say, undergrad, let's say graduate level degrees, the bachelor's degrees, master's degree, and so forth. But actually a very significant number, about a fifth of all the institutions or a fifth of all the enrollments globally are in short cycle institutions, that are much more focused on career, professional and vocational focus. And this has been one of the elements of diversification. Certainly, as we know, higher education institutions vary tremendously in terms of their size, their cost, their selectivity, the kind of programs they provide, the kind of instructional modalities that we'll talk about, and the extent to which they balance research and service. A third shift that I wish to mention has to do with the shifts in inequalities. And one of the things that we have seen is that as countries expand their higher education sector, the social economic inequalities among the student population tend to increase. So I know you can't read all the different countries that are listed here, but let me just indicate that most of the countries on the left side of this graph are countries that have very small or very moderate higher education sectors or systems. And these that are on the right side are countries that have expanded their systems of higher education. And here we can see, as we compare rates of higher education completion between those who come from some of the upper fifth of the household income levels and those in the lower fifth, we can see very large inequalities, and that these have tend to increase as systems get larger. These inequalities have also these kinds of social disparities can also be seen with respect to gender, although gender, as I mentioned, is changing depending on which part of the world and which sector. It tends to be much higher in low-income countries, the differences between, let's say, male enrollments and female enrollments. And finally, as systems expand, we see considerable social disparities with respect to ethnicity, migration status, indigenous group affiliation, language minorities, all of which have existed in the past, but often get exacerbated as the systems increase. The last the last point that I wish to make in terms of these kind of pre-COVID shifts has to do with public expenditure per student, or public expenditure in higher education. As we know, higher education is the most costly of all the levels of schooling. And one of the ways to look at this is by measuring it per student enrolled. And here you can see, although the data are a little bit dated, just, I guess, two things that are noteworthy. Number one, that these levels of public expenditure per student haven't changed dramatically, or they tend to be, by and large, fairly consistent, except for at the very bottom, the least developed countries. But they tend to be very consistent over time. That's certainly one pattern to make note of. But the other is the enormous disparity between, let's say, countries in the global north and countries in the global south with respect to how much is spent per pupil in higher education, and how much the governments allocate to support tertiary education based on those kinds of things. So it is not perhaps surprising that when you do collect information about how much households, individual households spend on higher education, we can really see big differences over time. So in other words, much of the shift in let's say, the emphasis or the commitment of governments to provide sufficient funding for public higher education means that households have to take up, as it were, the gap. And many households report spending much more as a proportion of their discretionary income on costs around tuition, books, and other fees associated with sending their children to higher education. And it's often in the poorest countries, it's the households that least can afford it who are spending huge proportions of the money that they have available, almost triple what that proportion would be than in the richer countries. So these are some of the outcomes of the lack of continuous support of tertiary education by government authorities. So, as I said, I think that there are interesting to take a look at how the extent to which some of these large long-term trends would continue in the post-COVID area, and how many of them may be modified or move in a particular direction. I think this could be topic of our conversation. Much of the information is still yet to be determined. But one thing that we have seen that I know all of you are very much aware of is that we see major changes in the kind of teaching and learning modalities in higher education systems. And I know that you have had access as part of the materials for this talk and for your workshop to talk a little bit about the different kinds of shifts in teaching and learning. It's a very interesting document that was shared. I'm going to actually also share my screen that shows the same issue so that you can see it more clearly. As we can see here, there are very different ways in which, one of the most important ways has a lot to do with the ways in which technology is being used and its impact on all kinds of teaching and learning modalities. I think everyone, regardless of the university and where it's located in the world, has been impacted in many ways by the shift toward more online and hybrid modes of learning. I was very lucky when the pandemic began that I was on sabbatical. So unlike many of my colleagues, wasn't forced to kind of almost overnight move toward an online remote version of my courses, but had sufficient time after several months when the fall semester began to have at least acquired the basic skills. But as we know, a lot of faculty are fairly unprepared or minimally prepared to deal with moving toward remote work. But even after we've done so, we see that there are many different ways to organize the instruction that we provide to keep students engaged and motivated, to provide the kinds of skills that they need. Certainly this varies by level of the degree. I certainly feel in my teaching as I speak, I often teach doctoral students that it's almost impossible to try to provide them with the skills and right kind of knowledge and approaches to developing a dissertation topic and interacting with their peers that are so essential at that level. And so in-person, face-to-face instruction, I think, is really critical for doctoral students. But at other levels, I think that there's certainly room, and we've seen now, my university, and I'm sure in many other institutions also in Pakistan, have developed many new programs in these modalities and providing opportunities for faculty to instruct or teach from home, and there's much more flexibility in that regard. But as we've seen that, this also increases the vulnerability of the institutions to various kinds of cybersecurity threats. I can tell you that at my university, the SUNY Albany, we've opened up a faculty or school of cybersecurity that has one of the largest increases in undergraduate degree programs, a huge demand on students who wish to have the skills because of the demand for these kinds of things in various parts of the higher education sector and more generally. We also see a real interest in using big data systems, which I think is quite interesting. I don't think that impacts how we teach and learn as much as it impacts institutional research that universities may engage in, but also the kind of research that young scholars might consider doing in reference to their own work. I guess here the economic issues are perhaps more prominent and certainly have had a huge impact because universities are often asking to increase tuition costs that are prohibitive in many parts of my country. But even in other countries, relative to household incomes, they're still very significant. This certainly puts a dent in the willingness or the ability of students that come from more modest backgrounds to enroll in higher education without being provided additional support. And it's one of the reasons that a lot of universities in the global north have developed all kinds of international programs or programs that have meant to invite and welcome students from all over the world to somehow meet the deficit, the financial shortfalls that many of these institutions have faced. I recently read this week that approximately 80 institutions of higher education in the US have essentially closed their doors in the last couple of years, primarily because of financial reasons. Obviously, the sector of higher education in the US is enormous, more than 4,000 institutions or so, but still it's noteworthy that a lot of institutions are experiencing threats to their viability and long-term survivability. And I think that this is a very interesting point. Okay, we could discuss these a little bit more. I was very interested to see some of the political references that are made here, but let me then just move to the concluding part of my presentation so we have time for discussion. So I would like to basically note, that many of the issues and dilemmas that we have faced in the system of higher education continue and in some ways have become either more prominent and more exacerbated, partly due to the COVID, and I'm sure this is a topic that we can address. And finally, I just wish to note that in my view, one of the very interesting ways that higher education can be mobilized to support the Sustainable Development Agenda is in particular with respect to SDG 16, which is around the fostering of peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. And when you might have a chance, one of the reports that I had the privilege of directing and helping to bring to fruition some years ago, the 2016 Global Education Monitoring Report, is also focused on the role of education generally and higher education in particular to support more peaceful and just societies. And here you have some of the key ways that the chapter that we wrote talks about mobilizes evidence that talks about the importance of mobilizing education in each of these ways that speaks to more peaceful and just societies going forward. So in conclusion, let me make the following kind of concluding points. First, I think it's quite clear that higher education should play a leading role in addressing many of the pressing social, economic, political, and environmental challenges of our time, most of which transcend national boundaries. Clearly, the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in particular opens up many opportunities for higher education institutions to rethink their mission, to contribute to sustainable development goal progress by forging new partnerships with different actors, both within and outside their national boundaries, in order to address both the local and these global challenges. And also, while there are still many contradictions in the higher education sector, in my view, wise leaders and faculty should seek ways to navigate their institutions in directions that contribute to sustainability, social justice, peace, and human dignity. And I think that these are very core issues. In terms of actual policies and practices that I think can help to move higher education institutions in this direction, I think it's, as I've mentioned, I think having a more holistic institution that places great emphasis on the notion of sustainability in the broadest sense is very important. I think the use of interdisciplinary programs is very important because it advances a more comprehensive and holistic approach to some of the intractable challenges that we face. I think that there's a value in both acknowledging and supporting local traditions and at the same time internationalizing the content of courses and programs. And I think it's important to rethink and redesign some of the extension services that are provided, whether it be farm field schools or other kinds of ways in which universities support agriculture or technical knowledge, and at the same time develop new partnerships in the community. And finally, as we've seen, certainly technology is playing a very noticeable role in ways that one could not, most of us would not have anticipated. I have colleagues in my School of Education who over the years have been experts in this area of, computer facilitated instruction and whatnot. It was a fairly esoteric field of inquiry, and clearly now, as so many programs and so many aspects of the university have moved online or gone remote, and all kinds of hybrid modalities have become much more the norm, their insights have become much more of a greater value for both administrators and deans and those of us involved in rethinking our courses. So I appreciate very much your kind listening to my thoughts at this time in the day, and I'm very happy to join in a conversation with you about some of the points that I've made. Thank you very much.
I think you gave a concept that as yet, I think not many of us are talking about sustainable education or SDGs, incorporation of SDGs. Do we do that in our mission? Because we are talking about, the gender balance. We're talking about inclusive societies, including diversity in our courses through multiple modalities of expression and otherwise. We are talking about, and we are doing that as well, that we are looking at supporting those who cannot afford to join. There's a whole lot going, but that's one institution. So when we're talking about as Pakistan as a whole, or even globally, of course, as you have explained, the dimensions change. And it was very, very interesting that your thesis about sustainable development goals and how it needs to be incorporated, especially 4.7, is a very powerful agenda to consider. We have a Dean of Humanities, Dr. Altaf, but we also had a question. Somebody raised a comment while we were talking about GDP in terms of economic inequality. Wasif Khan from Business School of Business. And I think it was a very valid observation that now how would things change if we talked about purchasing power parity? Because now when you compare between the North and the South, the GDP in dollars or any other account goes for a 6. It does not do justice to figures. So what would you say to that? That how does purchasing power parity affect that landscape that you explained just now?
Well, I think it raises a very important issue. And, over the years, in many countries, economists have held enormous power over policies around education, partly because of the kind of data that they mobilize to address, what kinds of policies are more or less effective in promoting productivity, income generation, and economic development, both locally, but certainly nationally. And as the colleague mentioned in his comment, at the same time, economists and many others have called into question the kind of traditional scales or assumptions that are used in the gross domestic product calculation, gross national product. And as I'm sure the colleagues are aware, beginning in, I guess, the 1980s, moving forward, at the University of Pennsylvania, they developed, these price parity purchase kind of, as it were, re-estimates of GDP. And as we begin to understand, when you purchase a local service, if I get my haircut in Islamabad and I get my haircut in New York City, the costs are very different, even though I'm assuming the quality of the haircut is about the same. And so the big differences is really in the importance of imported items that come from outside. And so almost in all the studies that I've done, when I look at, let's say, the relationship between educational expansion and economic development or growth, I've always used, these kind of PPP adjusted figures for GDP, because I think they're very important. But there are two other issues that I think many critics of this have raised. One has to do with the role of women and the fact that much of their work is not included in the formal labor market. There's no cash that is exchanged, and therefore these activities that women are engaged in at the household level or even in the marketplace often go unnoticed by the kind of traditional economic accounts. And so these are very significant, certainly for household viability and survivability. And that's one thing that I think many economists have yet to find a good solution. If you were to give a dollar value to the value of women's activities, it might increase GDP by a third. I've heard a very significant amount, so that's quite important. And the last point that I would make, which I think speaks to the issues that in my presentation here, is around sustainability. The GDP figures, whether you standardize them by PPP or not, do not speak to what kinds of activities are good for the environment or good for our communities, and what kinds of things are problematic, certainly in terms of the kinds of resources that might be available for coming generations. So in other words, if you have high rates of divorce and you have to hire lots of lawyers, this increases the GDP, but it may not be good for family solidarity and all kinds of other different things. So the question that a lot of people are asking is, we need perhaps better indicators of things that really speak to the genuine progress that we would like to see going forward, that speaks much more to sustainability and less to just the formal exchanging of cash and money in the formal market. And I do think it's worth noting that there are some new indicators that have been developed both by economists and others that provide a very different picture once you integrate a kind of a sustainability dimension in how the economy is changing over time. But certainly it's an important question that we should all think about going forward.
Thank you. Altaf, you can unmute and ask your question. It would be nice to see you too.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Aaron, for the wonderful speech. I really enjoyed it. And
so my question is, it sounds like you feel university should be dedicated to sustainability and social justice. But isn't the university's greatest responsibility to send graduates into society who are critical thinkers? If they're truly critical thinkers, they will adopt the best approaches to justice and sustainable issues. But they'll do so not because they were taught to think that, but because they were taught how to think. I'm just concerned that we're going to stop raising critical thinkers who look at all the different aspects, instead just raise people who think what we think they should think.
That's a very valid point. Yes, Aaron?
Yeah, no, I was very careful about certain parts of my presentation that I didn't want to step on anyone's toes. I obviously believe that the critical importance of universities is the kind of free inquiry, open debate, the willingness to allow students and faculty independent thinking and critical thinking, both of their communities, the world as a whole, and of the societies in which they live. I think that that's a fundamental part. But obviously, as we've seen, as I'm sure you're aware of, often this may be sensitive to the political regimes in which the universities are located, and often some of the political leaders would look to stifle or undermine or find ways to put pressure on faculty and universities in these areas. So, I mean, I think we need to be aware of that and be sensitive to those kinds of issues. I can't speak to precisely how that plays out in Pakistan, but I'm certainly, having spent time in Japan, not in Japan, but in China and in other parts of the world, I'm very much aware of how certain things, especially the public display of some of these issues, can be seen as very problematic. But to your point, I embrace it entirely. I think we need thinking, independent-minded students who can weigh lots of different kinds of issues. Having said that, as a planet, as a community of global citizens, we are facing challenges today that are urgent and pressing. And if all we're going to do is teach our students to contemplate, different avenues, in the meantime, we are going to be experiencing the impact of climate change and other massive shifts in the weather patterns. And I don't have to say anything about this in what Pakistan, especially in the Sindh province, is now experiencing. These are things that all around the world. And so I think we have both a duty to address these kind of urgent, pressing challenges in a morally and a skillful way, while at the same time keeping an open mind as to what might be the most effective ways, what would be different kinds of approaches, how to weigh the evidence. So I think both of these things we have to hold in our hands, a moral commitment to make the world a better and more habitable and livable place, while at the same time ensuring that our students are good thinkers, are capable thinkers, are engaged in independent and critical thinking about their own lives and the lives of the people that they come into contact with.
Yeah, thank you so much. I hope that satisfies you, Bob. That I would like to now call on Altaf. Over to you.
Thank you, and I hope that I will be able to complete my question.
Yeah, absolutely.
Keeping
I
my
think
fingers.
Bob had written it in the chat and probably misunderstood that I had called him out. No issue.
It was a very important question, and it was also
Very,
part
yeah.
of the comments that I wanted to make.
Yeah.
I'll thank you again, Aaron, for this holistic approach to the higher education system that most of the time we don't do that. My comment on basically, I was also going to talk about critical thinking, and I had the opportunity last year to work with on a project where I visited 5 universities and offered trainings in critical dialogue, because this is one of the UNESCO recommendations to lessen violence on campuses. So higher education institutions as vehicles of critical dialogue, and which could normalize our culture. So that's one area which is very interesting. Also, I'm really interested in 2 of your projects, basically about peace education, since we hold one conference every year in collaboration with Oslo Metropolitan University, who are basically partners with UNESCO on peace journalism. So this is happening in October 11th to 13th again. So and also on the climate change, we do those also. So we did one in spring, and we are going to hold another one in fall. In December, because one of our partners is participating in COP. So in November, so we decided to do this in December. My question is that we are doing it, and we are trying to get some interdisciplinarity into it. But when we think about 1 or 2 disciplines, collaborations are easier. But when we try to spread it in a whole university system, it's difficult. Like, it's not that easy. Like making one department heading something and 2, 3 others collaborating is easier. But if you want to get peace education or climate or critical dialogue, that's a difficult ask. So I just wanted to have your views on how to do it in a larger structure where the whole university could be involved.
So thank you very much for your very important questions. Let me take the climate issue first and then come back to the peace question. So first of all, I think that we need to keep in mind that this is a process. And this kind of a process involves a dialogue. So one of the key things, if an institution is to think holistically of bringing together different players who are interested in issues around climate change or sustainability, the university leadership, I would say, needs to provide seed money or at least foster a kind of initial dialogue among some of the leading scholars or people that are doing research in this area, so they can get to know a little bit better the ways in which they're approaching this issue. And do they have areas of shared interest or even collaborations that they might envision in terms of research proposals and other ways that they can engage in each other. So I think if you build these kinds of collaborations, kind of small scale after dialogue, and then little by little, you can begin to imagine a kind of a broader program that becomes institutionalized and established. Just this week, my alma mater that was mentioned, Stanford University, opened a new school of sustainability, right? I believe it took probably 4 or 5 years for them to get to this particular point. I have a colleague who's part of the MEIS project. She's been instrumental in helping the university move in this direction. But it brings together earth sciences and engineering and people in humanities and the social sciences. It's exactly the kind of, all institutional or institutional wide kind of a school, very interdisciplinary, but it isn't something you can do overnight. It certainly needs a commitment and some resources, modest, I think, to ensure that this dialogue begins, that collaborations go forward, that students get interested in these kinds of things. And after some period of time, you can begin to think, okay, can we redefine the nature of some of the main institutional framework of our university in order to reflect this work that has already been ongoing, but now give it kind of some institutional roots and concretization. So I think it's possible, but it is clearly something that takes time. With respect to the issue of peace, obviously this is an incredible challenging issue, has many different dimensions. Certainly in the country in which I'm currently living in the US, we have all kinds of issues around violent behavior and threatening behavior and polarization of attitudes of different groups of individuals. Really in all my lifetime, I can't remember a more polarized time politically than we're experiencing now. And certainly violent threats have been on the increase. So this is a problem that affects countries, in many parts of the world in different ways, partly because of their history and their culture and whatnot. So again, the question becomes, how can we kind of shift some of the ways in which we teach and educate our students, maybe that goes beyond just doing well on examinations, maybe that goes beyond just cognitive learning to memorize certain facts, maybe that includes and embraces more social and emotional issues, more attitudinal dispositions. How do we engage in active listening? How do we engage in intercultural communication? I mean, in some ways, the technologies are there. If you want to have a conversation with people in various parts of the world, you have now platforms, people who are, increasingly different. Or if you want to bring in people who address or that represent very different kinds of issues. I mean, the Canadians, bring in indigenous groups and things like that. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which you can build kind of mutual recognition and different ways to develop tolerance. It is not simple. It is not easy. It needs sustained work. But I think that we should not shy away from those things that are very critical, again, to our viability as a planet, as a global community, because many of the issues that we face cannot be solved just within in the boundaries of our particular country, but really deserve and need to be addressed in regional organizations and associations and meeting together with our neighbors and finding ways for dialogue and discussion and common ground. You're muted, dear.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron. Yeah, I know. I'm trying to click on it while I see Derek Baker. If you could please, environmental sciences, he's the head of, so you touched a nerve over there, Aaron, with climate change and sustainability. Gee, Derek.
Yeah, thank you, Aaron, for a really nice talk on higher education. Have you seen a shift to more and permanent online teaching due to COVID? I mean, online teaching as a part of distance education has been around for a very long time, but this massive shift to online education, from our experience here at FC College, we've gone back to face-to-face, and there is no permanent residue there in terms of online teaching. But have you got any data that would suggest that, across the board, that universities are much more capitalizing on the online market?
I mean, it's a difficult question to answer in any kind of generalized way. I think different universities and different countries have made shifts in different ways. So certainly now we have also, tech companies, private companies that are trying to support universities to improve the platforms and provide software services and all kinds of things to support, more remote instruction and to make it more engaging and motivating. I think most of us that were forced into remote teaching over the last 2 years have found it to be fairly exhausting, and many of our students have found it to be very exhausting. I mean, it's one thing to do it, 1 or 2 days, but to go through a whole semester in which the only way in which you interact with the faculty is through these two-dimensional spaces, online. I mean, it certainly provides some opportunities, but it also makes for a very, very different kind of a learning experience. And having said that, and I can speak a little bit, again, based on the personal experiences in my department, we tend to serve a lot of older professionals in the area of education, people that are experienced teachers and headmasters and principals, and people who wish to go on to become school leaders and superintendents and other positions of leadership in the education sector. Many of them have full-time jobs, they have families. So for them, actually, remote and online instruction is quite helpful, because it doesn't mean they have to get in the car after a long day of work. Most of our classes are in the afternoon and evenings, and come to the university when they're usually quite tired, and what that means for their families. So they in some ways prefer a lot of the distance education, whereas some of the younger scholars who are less encumbered by all kinds of work and family constraints are very much interested in face-to-face instruction. I personally feel that I'm still very much a neophyte in terms of my ability to provide a kind of an innovative, engaging, kind of a remote instruction environment. I do the best I can, but I still am very, very much a beginner in this regard, and I defer to some of my colleagues. But my feeling is that, especially for some of our kind of upper level graduate, as I mentioned, at the doctoral level, I just don't think that you can do a good dissertation by having been instructed through remote education during the formative years of your doctoral training. It's a little bit different at the undergraduate, let's say the BA or the MA levels, where it is, but even there, something is lost and something is gained. But I feel that in terms of quality, a lot more is lost. And the last thing I would leave you with in this area is that if we think a little bit more differentially about the needs of different kinds of students that we engage in our universities and colleges, I would venture to say that among the students who come from the most disadvantaged backgrounds, whose parents were not highly educated, who didn't have university backgrounds, that for them, they're most vulnerable to a learning platform that is only computer mediated and involved in remote education. They probably more so than any other of the students that we engage are very much in need of role models, of interpersonal interaction, of developing a sense of trust. And I mean, I'm sure all of us can think back of the teachers that we had when we went through universities, and the role models that they played in terms of, forming our sense of what's moral, what's important in life, how we wish to kind of conduct ourselves going forward, the kinds of occupations and careers that we want to embark upon. I just can't see that happening in a distance education mode. You really need, a real encounter. So if we continue with remote education, it's having a differential effect on the students that we bring into colleges and universities, and we need to be cognizant of that as we begin to make decisions.
I thank you so much, Aaron. I don't see any more questions, but very well, answer to all the queries raised. I do see a Sabah, but she commented on how important social emotional learning had become in the new higher education landscape. We are drawing to a close. Actually, we are a few minutes beyond our time. May I invite Dr. Trimble, our Vice Rector, Dr. Douglas Trimble, to put up his concluding comments. And then I'd like to invite our Rector, Dr. Jonathon Addolton, for his thanks to you, notes sort of a thing, thank you notes. Dr. Trimble.
Dr. Benavot, I really appreciated your time and your drawing us to focusing us on some of these issues that have been around with us for a while, some of the traditional goals, but also some of the emergent trends as well. That was helpful. I think that as we think about this post-COVID landscape, certainly we saw movement toward online education explode during that time. It was the only way to go forward. But as we've talked about here recently, we've seen some issues and some concerns about, and you articulated them quite well in terms of what does learning look like and how can it be done well in an online environment, in terms of engagement, in terms of student learning outcomes, in terms of identifiability of student work and plagiarism and cheating. And so we've seen students really glad to get back in the classroom. But one of the issues that comes up for us is as we're in the process of getting accreditation in the United States, that our accreditors are reluctant to engage, have us do online education. They're actually only interested in us doing in-person education. And so a lot of that has to do with issues of quality. And so that raises some issues for us of what does the future look like to develop delivering our education effectively to different constituencies. And I really appreciated you highlighting the different age groups and the different sorts of economic backgrounds and some of those things that we should be thinking about in terms of online education. Thank you for the broad spectrum of things that you brought to us. I'm looking at the NISM website, and that's I see that it's highlighting socio-educational, I'm getting it wrong, SEL.
Social emotional learning.
Learning, yeah.
Learning.
Social emotional, yeah.
And thank you, Anish, for putting that link in the chat. That was helpful. And so the range of things we've talked about this evening for us, morning for you, have been very helpful. So thank you, Aaron.
Yes.
My pleasure.
And, Dr. Addolton, if you could sort of please join us.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I'll say a couple quick words, but I do want to thank Dr. Rukhsana as well as Dr. Benavot for this session. Thank you for organizing it. And as Dr. Trimble said, very interesting, very informative, challenging in some ways, a catalyst, I think, for some good comments as well. I guess I would say that as I was looking through is a lot of the things that you said resonates very strongly at Foreman and in Pakistan more broadly. I know your experience is global, but I don't know if it includes Pakistan. But it would be fun to continue a conversation on some of these things. I was noticing some of the changes in landscape and just thinking, sort of looking at Foreman through that lens. Obviously, private sector institution, although actually was nationalized and then denationalized, so that's part of our history as well. Nearly half of our undergraduate enrollment is female. Almost 2/3 of our graduate students are female, so part of that trend perhaps. You'd be surprised how many first generation college students we have here. And I think you'd find some stories here that are pretty intriguing and frankly pretty inspiring when it comes to that. And of course, that's partly the financial aid program. I think more than most universities, we have significant part of resources go to financial aid. And I think that provides this sort of campus profile that is one of our strengths, is that people come here and they have a campus that has this broad range and diversity. I guess some of the other things was just the challenges, the wake-up calls. I think were good. The post-COVID characteristics. I think there were 9 that you listed, and this is why I guess I'll extend that invitation to come to Lahore sometime, because on each one of those 9, I think we'd have a fascinating conversation, and I think it's a conversation that might surprise, maybe not you because you've been around for a long time, but I think might surprise some people about, again, both Pakistan and Foreman. So I'm serious about that. I'll end, as we often do in Pakistan, with what we call a vote of thanks, because I think it's been a very interesting discussion. This entire week, in fact, I think has been very, very good. I think 220 faculty were online here to listen to this. And so it's been a great discussion, and we really appreciate it. I think this is an example of what you've talked about how Zoom, how the COVID experience makes us open to these kinds of conversations. We are an institution that actually, I would say, the college, the community experience is so vital to us. But I also think that these kinds of conversations and bringing you and your willingness to join us, again, a huge appreciation for that. But I think it's been a great discussion, and I'd love to see you in Lahore someday. So thank you, shukriya.
And you'll be surprised, Aaron, most of our, though the faculty, Dr. Trimble and Addolton are from America, they will speak excellent Urdu. So we dare not say anything in Urdu around them, just in case. So we have to be doubly careful. But thank you so much. And like Dr. Addolton said, there were 220 of us. Now we have 200, and we have most of them are giving in, sending in their thanks in the chat. It was a very, very informative session, and I thank you once again. And hopefully we'll have you around for another couple of. We'd love to hear what you are doing, and especially those indicators that you're developing for humanistic and sustainable education would be very powerful to talk about. So thank you so much once again, and you can go back to sleep now probably.
I think after 2 cups of coffee that will be almost impossible. But I appreciate very much the kind words, and wish you all a wonderful evening, and I do hope that we'll have a chance to meet in person and interact. And thank you very much again for this opportunity to engage in a dialogue with you. All the best. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Dr. Trimble and Dr. Addolton. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It was great to see you, so many of you. And we hope to have some sessions in person. We'll see you soon. Okay, bye-bye.